"Dad, she's living in my house." I whispered those words into a hospital phone at 4 in the morning, 3 days after an emergency C-section, my newborn son asleep in a bassinet beside my bed, an IV still taped to the back of my hand. On the other end of the line, my father was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet I had known my whole life, the quiet that meant he was thinking faster than his voice was letting on. Then he asked me only one question. "Is Eli safe with you right now?" "Yes." "Then that's the only thing that matters tonight. Get some sleep. I'll handle the house." I did not sleep. I lay in that hospital bed listening to the soft mechanical hum of monitors and the small, uneven breathing of my son. And I thought about my husband, Dylan, who had not answered his phone in 11 hours, who had left me here alone after my blood pressure spiked so dangerously during labor that the doctors used the word critical twice in the same sentence, who had, according to a text from my sister-in-law that I almost wished I had never opened, moved a woman named Portia Lang into our house while I was still recovering from surgery 3 miles away. My father, Walter Hastings, spent 32 years as a real estate title officer before he retired, examining property records for a living, tracing ownership histories back through decades of transfers, liens, and quiet mistakes that people made when they assumed paperwork was a formality rather than a foundation. Dylan had always found that career mildly amusing, the kind of job he described at dinner parties as unglamorous but harmless. He had no idea, walking a stranger into a house 4 years earlier while his wife lay in a hospital bed with their newborn son, exactly how unharmless my father's attention to paperwork was about to become. I had married Dylan 6 years earlier, back when he was warm in a way that felt effortless, the kind of person who remembered which coffee order belonged to which coworker, who called his mother every Sunday, who cried, quietly and without embarrassment, at our wedding when my father walked me down the aisle. For the first 2 years, our marriage looked exactly like the life I had wanted since I was young enough to draw pictures of houses with 2 chimneys and a dog in the yard. We bought a modest colonial on Ferndale Street in the same town where I grew up, 4 years ago now, during a housing market so competitive that our initial offer had been outbid twice before we finally secured it, and only because my father had quietly offered to cover a significant portion of the down payment, insisting, gently but firmly, that the contribution be documented properly through his attorney, rather than simply wired over as an informal family gift. Dylan had resisted at first, the way proud people resist help they secretly need, but eventually agreed, assuming, as most people assume about family generosity, that a signature on a piece of paper was a formality rather than a fact that might someday matter enormously. What Dylan never fully understood, because he skimmed the closing documents the way he skimmed most things longer than a single page, was that my father's contribution had not simply been recorded as a gift toward our joint down payment. On my father's insistence, and against Dylan's mild, distracted objection at the closing table, the property had been titled solely in my name, with Dylan listed as a co-borrower on the mortgage, responsible for half the monthly payment, but not as an owner on the deed itself. My father had explained his reasoning to me privately, months before the wedding, in a conversation I had mostly forgotten until the night I called him from that hospital bed. He told me he had watched, over 3 decades in his profession, entirely too many marriages end with one spouse discovering, usually far too late, that love and legal protection were not the same thing, and that his own sister, my Aunt Diane, had lost her home in a divorce 20 years earlier specifically, because she had never confirmed whose name actually appeared on the title. He told me he was not preparing for Dylan to fail me. He was simply making sure that if anyone ever did, I would not also lose the roof over my head while grieving the person who was supposed to have been standing under it beside me. The pregnancy had been difficult almost from the beginning, not dramatically so, but persistently, low-grade complications that required more monitoring than my first trimester with our older daughter, Nora, ever had. Around month 7, I started noticing the same slow drift in Dylan that I had heard other women describe and never quite believed until I lived it myself. Late nights he explained away as deadlines. A new gym membership that somehow required attendance at hours when most gyms were closed. A phone he began angling away from me on the kitchen counter in a gesture so small I told myself I was imagining it. I mentioned it once to my sister, Claudia, who told me pregnancy hormones could make anyone paranoid, and I let that explanation comfort me because the alternative felt too large to hold. While also preparing for a delivery, my doctor had already flagged as higher risk than my first. I did not know, during those final weeks of pregnancy, that Dylan had been introducing a coworker named Portia Lang to friends at his office holiday party as someone he described, according to two people who later gave statements, as the person who finally understood him. I did not know that 3 weeks before my due date, Dylan had quietly added Portia to the lease of a storage unit where he had begun, slowly and methodically, moving boxes of things he described to me as donations for Nora's old baby items. I did not know any of it, because I was doing what I had always done in our marriage, which was trust the person standing across the kitchen from me, instead of running the kind of careful verification my father had spent his entire career teaching other people to run on everything except the person they loved most. Eli was born on a Tuesday morning after 19 hours of labor that ended, not the way we had planned, but in an operating room full of urgent, controlled voices discussing blood pressure numbers that made the anesthesiologist's face change in a way I will never forget. I remember very little of the actual surgery, only the sensation of pressure without pain, and Dylan's hand, gripping mine tightly at first, then loosening, by the time they placed Eli briefly against my chest before whisking him to the NICU for observation, not present at all, because Dylan had stepped out to take a phone call he later described as work-related. I spent the next 3 days in a recovery unit with severe postpartum preeclampsia, blood pressure numbers the nurses monitored every 20 minutes, a headache that made the hospital lights feel like something physical pressing against my skull, and a husband who visited for increasingly shorter windows, always checking his phone, always finding a reason to step into the hallway. On the third night, unable to sleep, I called our home phone, the landline my father had insisted we keep for emergencies, mostly out of habit, expecting no answer. A woman answered instead. I remember the silence that followed almost more clearly than the words themselves, her voice, unfamiliar, slightly startled, saying, "Hello, who's calling?" as though she had every right to be standing in my kitchen at 11 at night answering my phone. I asked who I was speaking with. She hesitated, then said her name was Portia, and that Dylan was in the shower. I hung up without saying anything else, because I genuinely did not trust my own voice in that moment, and because some analytical, exhausted corner of my mind understood that whatever I said next needed to matter more than whatever I felt like screaming. I called my father instead at 4 a.m, 3 days postpartum, my son asleep beside me, and told him, in a whisper I barely recognized as my own voice, that a woman was living in my house. He asked only whether Eli was safe with me, and when I told him yes, he told me to sleep, and that he would handle the house. I want to be honest about something, because I think honesty matters more here than making the story sound cleaner than it actually was. I did not sleep. I lay awake for hours turning over 11 years of memory. The wedding where Dylan cried, the Sunday calls to his mother, the 2 chimneys and the dog we eventually got named Biscuit, wondering how much of it had already stopped being true before I noticed, and how much I had simply chosen, the way people do, not to run the model on my own life, the way I would have run it on anyone else's. My father arrived at the house on Ferndale Street the following morning at 8 o'clock, not with anger, but with the specific, methodical calm of a man who had spent 32 years documenting exactly the kind of situation he was now walking into personally. He did not knock loudly or demand entry. He used his own key, the spare Dylan and I had given him years earlier for emergencies exactly like watering plants during vacations, and let himself into the kitchen, where he found Portia Lang standing at the counter in one of my bathrobes, drinking coffee from a mug that had been a wedding gift from Dylan's grandmother. According to what my father told me later, in the calm, unhurried way he told most things, he did not raise his voice. He simply introduced himself and asked her politely whether she understood whose name appeared on the property deed for the house she was currently standing inside. Portia, by his account, laughed at first, assuming this was some outdated formality, and told him Dylan had explained that the house belonged to both of them. My father set his leather folder on the kitchen table, the same folder he had carried into countless closings over 3 decades, and slid a single certified copy of the deed across the counter toward her. Sole owner, he told her, tapping the page. Grace Hastings Ellison. Not Dylan. Not jointly. Solely. Portia's expression, he said, changed the way expressions change when a person realizes, in real time, that the floor they believed they were standing on was never actually load-bearing. Dylan came downstairs a few minutes later to find my father seated calmly at our kitchen table, and Portia standing near the counter holding the deed with visibly unsteady hands. According to my father, Dylan's first instinct was not to apologize, but to ask what my father thought he was doing in his house. My father answered without raising his voice, the way he answered most confrontations in his professional life, by simply stating a fact rather than an accusation. This has never been your house, Dylan. You've been a co-borrower on the mortgage for 4 years. You've never been an owner on the deed. Dylan told him that was a technicality, that everyone understood the house belonged to both of us, that my father was twisting paperwork to punish him for a personal decision that had nothing to do with property law. My father, according to his own account, simply looked at him and said, "Your wife is 3 days out of emergency surgery, recovering from a pregnancy complication severe enough that her doctors used the word critical, and you brought another woman into her home while she was in the hospital with your son. This has everything to do with property law, because property law is the only language you seem to still respect." Dylan had no response to that, or at least none my father considered worth repeating to me. What he told Dylan next, calmly, was simple. He had until 5 o'clock that afternoon to remove Portia's belongings from the house, or my father would contact the police to report an unauthorized occupant residing in a property where she held no legal right to remain, since I, the sole title holder, had never granted her permission to live there. Dylan protested that he lived there too, that he was on the mortgage, that surely that granted him some authority to invite whoever he wanted into his own residence. My father agreed that Dylan's name on the mortgage did entitle him to remain in the house himself, since removing a co-borrower from a residence without legal process was its own complicated matter, but reminded him that his authority extended only to himself, not to inviting third parties to occupy a property titled solely in someone else's name against that owner's wishes. By 5 that afternoon, Portia's belongings were gone. I came home from the hospital 4 days later with Eli, wrapped in the same blanket Nora had come home in 3 years earlier. Still moving carefully, still sore, still processing the specific vertigo of learning that the person who was supposed to be steadying you through the hardest week of your life had instead been quietly building an exit ramp out of it. Dylan was there when we arrived, subdued, apologetic in the vague, deflecting way people are apologetic when they are more sorry about being caught than about what they actually did. He told me it had been a mistake, that things had gotten complicated with Portia during the pregnancy because he felt disconnected from me, that he never meant for me to find out this way, as though there existed some better way to find out your husband moved another woman into your house while you were recovering from surgery with your newborn son in a hospital bassinet beside you. I did not scream. I did not throw anything. I set Eli's car seat down on the kitchen table, the same table where my father had, days earlier, calmly informed Dylan that the ground beneath him had never actually belonged to him, and I told Dylan I needed him to leave for the night so I could think clearly with a newborn in the house. He left without much argument, which told me, more than anything he said, that some part of him had already begun preparing for an outcome he did not yet want to say out loud. Over the following 2 weeks, I learned, in fragments, the fuller shape of what had happened during the final months of my pregnancy. Claudia, my sister, who had heard rumors from a mutual friend but hadn't wanted to burden me during a high-risk pregnancy, finally told me that Dylan had introduced Portia to several coworkers at his company's holiday party as, in his words, someone who finally understood him, 3 weeks before I delivered Eli by emergency C-section. A neighbor 2 houses down, Mrs. Okonkwo, who had watched our street for 20 years the way longtime neighbors do, mentioned, almost apologetically, that she had seen Portia's car in our driveway on multiple evenings during my final trimester, always leaving before midnight, always parked a few houses away rather than directly in front. The small, careful choreography of someone trying not to be noticed while still needing, apparently, to be present. And Dylan's own mother, in a conversation that clearly cost her something to have, admitted that she had known about Portia for nearly 2 months before Eli was born and had chosen not to tell me because, in her words, she didn't want to add stress to a difficult pregnancy. I understood, intellectually, the impulse behind that silence. I still felt it as its own smaller betrayal. One more person who had decided my comfort mattered less than protecting a story that was quietly falling apart around me. My father, when I finally asked him how long he had suspected something was wrong before that 4 a.m. phone call, told me the truth without softening it. He said he had noticed, over the past year, that Dylan had stopped meeting his eyes fully during family dinners, a small tell he had learned to recognize decades earlier reviewing title disputes, where one party already knew the ground they were standing on was compromised. He told me he hadn't said anything because suspicion without evidence only damages a marriage further, and because he had learned, professionally and personally, that the kindest thing you can sometimes do for someone you love is prepare quietly for a possibility you hope never arrives, rather than alarming them with a fear you cannot yet prove. I asked him whether the deed arrangement, 4 years earlier, had been about protecting me from exactly this. He was quiet for a moment before answering. "I hoped it would never matter," he said. "I structured it because your Aunt Diane lost her home over a signature she never bothered to verify, and because I promised myself, after watching that happen to my own sister, that no one I loved would ever lose their house along with their marriage. I didn't do it because I doubted Dylan specifically. I did it because I've spent 32 years learning that love is not proof of anything on a title report." That sentence settled into me slowly over the following weeks, the way true things sometimes do, arriving quietly rather than all at once. Dylan filed for divorce 11 days after I brought Eli home, a petition delivered not by him personally, but by a process server who knocked on the door while I was mid-diaper change, holding a squirming, unhappy infant on one arm while signing for legal paperwork with the other. The petition, when I finally read it that evening after both children were asleep, was almost breathtaking in its confidence, requesting that Dylan retain primary residence in the marital home, citing his name on the mortgage as evidence of ownership, and proposing a settlement that would have required me and 2 children to vacate within 60 days, while he continued living in the house he had, 4 days earlier, watched his own mother-in-law's careful paperwork strip from beneath him. I forwarded the petition to my father before I even finished reading it fully. And he read it that same night, sitting at his own kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and called me the next morning with a calm I had come to recognize as his particular flavor of controlled fury. "He's negotiating from a position he doesn't actually have," he said. "Let his attorney find that out the way attorneys usually find these things out, by finally reading the paperwork." My father recommended an attorney, a careful, unhurried woman named Priyanka Desmukh, who specialized in family law cases involving disputed property ownership. And within a week, she had filed a response establishing, clearly and with certified documentation, that the Ferndale Street property was titled solely in my name, that Dylan held no ownership interest whatsoever, and that any request for him to retain primary residence in the home would need to be evaluated entirely separately from any assumption of ownership his petition had incorrectly implied. Dylan's attorney requested an emergency meeting once the response landed, and Priyanka, along with my father, who insisted on attending given his direct involvement in the original title structure, met with Dylan and his attorney in a conference room downtown on a gray Tuesday morning, while I stayed home with the children, unable to sit through the meeting myself, and unwilling to give Dylan the satisfaction of watching me absorb whatever came next in real time. My father described the meeting to me that evening much the way he had described the kitchen table conversation with Portia weeks earlier, without embellishment, simply laying out what had happened in order. Dylan's attorney had opened confidently, describing the mortgage as clear evidence of shared ownership intent, suggesting that even without formal title, Dylan possessed an equitable interest in the property, given 4 years of mortgage payments and improvements he claimed to have personally funded, including a renovated kitchen and a finished basement. Priyanka had listened patiently, then produced, one by one, records showing that the kitchen renovation had actually been paid for using funds from my separate savings account, inherited from my grandmother 2 years before the wedding, and that the basement finishing, while genuinely completed with Dylan's labor, had used materials purchased with funds transferred from an account solely in my name. Dylan's equitable interest argument, built on the assumption that no one would bother checking the actual paper trail behind his claimed contributions, collapsed page by page in front of him. What ended the meeting entirely, according to my father, was a document Priyanka introduced almost as an afterthought near the end of the discussion, a printed copy of an email Dylan had sent from his work account 9 months earlier, before Eli's birth, to a company IT administrator, requesting personal cloud storage space to back up what he described in the message as important financial and property documents he wanted preserved outside the house in case things ever got messy with Grace. That single sentence, discovered during routine discovery after Dylan's company, entirely unrelated to our divorce, had opened its own internal review of his email usage following an unrelated complaint from a coworker about inappropriate personal correspondence sent using company systems, had done more damage to Dylan's credibility than almost anything else in the entire proceeding, because it proved, in his own words, written 9 months before I ever discovered anything, that he had already been anticipating and preparing for a version of events where our marriage ended messily, while still allowing me to believe, during the most physically dangerous pregnancy of my life, that nothing was wrong. His attorney, my father said, went very quiet reading that email. Dylan, when asked directly by his own attorney during a private break whether he had genuinely believed our marriage was stable when he sent it, reportedly had no answer that satisfied anyone in the room, including himself. The following weeks brought a slow, cascading unraveling that felt, in a strange way, less satisfying than I had expected and more simply inevitable, the way a structure collapses once its actual foundation, rather than its appearance of stability, is finally exposed. Dylan's company completed its internal review and placed him on a formal performance improvement plan, after confirming that he had used corporate email and cloud storage systems extensively for personal matters unrelated to work, including correspondence describing coworkers, and, in 2 documented instances, describing me in terms that several colleagues found troubling enough to report independently. He was not terminated, but the promotion he had been quietly expecting for over a year, one he had mentioned to me with real excitement months earlier, back before Portia, back before the storage unit, back before any of it, was awarded instead to someone else on his team. Portia, for her part, stopped answering Dylan's calls within 3 weeks of the deed confrontation in our kitchen, according to Claudia, who heard it secondhand from the same mutual friend who had first told her about the holiday party. Whatever fantasy Portia had constructed around a man she believed owned a comfortable house on Ferndale Street, evidently could not survive contact with a certified copy of a deed that said otherwise. I want to pause here and say something honestly, because I think it matters more than the satisfaction of watching consequences arrive. I did not feel triumphant during any of this. I felt, most days, simply exhausted, caring for a newborn and a 3-year-old while my marriage dissolved in increments through certified mail and conference room meetings I wasn't even present for. The nights were the hardest. Feeding Eli at 2 in the morning in the nursery, Dylan and I had painted together the summer before I got pregnant. Staring at the small mobile of paper stars, we had assembled one Sunday afternoon while listening to music and laughing about nothing in particular, and understanding that the version of Dylan capable of that Sunday afternoon and the version of Dylan capable of moving another woman into our house while I recovered from surgery were, somehow, impossibly, the same person. Grief, I learned, does not disappear simply because the facts finally arrived to justify it. It just finally has somewhere honest to land. My father came by most evenings during those weeks, sometimes simply to hold Eli while I gave Nora a bath, sometimes to sit at the kitchen table doing the crossword while I cried quietly over dishes I didn't actually need to wash, never pushing, never offering advice I hadn't asked for, simply present in the specific, steady way he had been present my entire life. One evening, exhausted and raw, I finally asked him the question that had been sitting underneath most of my thoughts for weeks. Did you ever imagine, when you structured that deed 4 years ago, that it would actually come to this? He set down his coffee and considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. I hoped it wouldn't, he said, but hope was never the plan. The plan was making sure that if it did, you'd still have a floor to stand on while you figured out everything else. I asked him whether he blamed himself for not saying something sooner, for watching Dylan avoid his eyes at dinner for a year and staying quiet about it. He shook his head slowly. I've spent 32 years learning that you can't force someone to see a fracture they're not ready to look at, he said. All you can do is make sure the building doesn't come down on top of them when they finally do. The final custody and property hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late spring, 5 months after Eli's birth, in a courtroom that felt smaller and less dramatic than anything I had imagined during the sleepless nights leading up to it. Dylan arrived looking diminished in a way that had little to do with his actual appearance, his confidence visibly thinner than it had been at our wedding, at Nora's birth, at every milestone I had once assumed we would keep sharing together. The judge, a measured woman named Judge Alvarez, who had clearly read every document in the file before either attorney said a word, moved through the property matter first, confirming, based on the certified deed, the documented separate funding of the kitchen and basement renovations, and the absence of any legal ownership interest on Dylan's part, that the Ferndale Street property would remain solely mine, with Dylan retaining no equitable claim. Dylan's attorney did not contest this finding strongly, having clearly advised him weeks earlier, according to Priyanka, that the paper trail left little room for argument. The custody portion of the hearing took longer and required something harder than paperwork, an honest accounting of the months surrounding Eli's birth. Judge Alvarez asked Dylan directly whether he disputed that he had introduced another woman into the family home during his wife's 3rd trimester of a high-risk pregnancy. He did not dispute it. She asked whether he disputed that Portia Lang had been residing in the home during the period I was hospitalized following an emergency C-section. He did not dispute that either. Judge Alvarez lowered her glasses the way judges seem to do specifically, before saying something that will matter. Infidelity, on its own, does not determine custody in this state, she said, echoing language I would later learn was almost standard in these proceedings, and Dylan visibly relaxed for a brief moment, the same small, premature relief I imagine he'd felt in that conference room before the deed collapsed his ownership argument. Then she continued. However, a parent's judgment regarding the well-being and emotional security of young children during periods of family crisis is directly relevant to custody determinations, and the court has reviewed documentation, including a corporate email dated 9 months prior to the child's birth, suggesting the respondent was preparing for the dissolution of this marriage, while his wife remained unaware of any instability. During a pregnancy, her medical records confirm was classified as high risk. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The ruling, when it came nearly 20 minutes later, granted me primary residential custody of both children, with Dylan receiving structured, gradually increasing parenting time contingent on consistent participation in co-parenting counseling. A condition Judge Alvarez noted was intended less as punishment than as an acknowledgement that trust, once broken this specifically, required demonstrated rebuilding rather than assumed restoration. Outside the courthouse, in the gray, ordinary light of a Thursday afternoon that felt strangely unremarkable given everything it had just concluded, Dylan approached me while my father waited a respectful distance away holding Eli's car seat. "I'm sorry," Dylan said, and I studied his face for a long moment, genuinely trying to locate whatever grief or shame lived beneath the words. I believed him in the narrow, specific way you can believe someone is sorry about consequences without fully believing they understand the harm that produced them. "I know you are," I said. "I don't think you understood what you were doing until it was already done. But understanding it now doesn't undo what Eli's first week of life actually looked like." He nodded, looking down at his hands. "I should have told you about Portia before Eli was born," he said, "instead of letting you find out from a stranger answering our phone." I agreed, quietly, that this was true, and told him that some conversations, however painful, are still kinder than the alternative of learning the truth secondhand while recovering from surgery. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether my father had planned the deed structure specifically because he never trusted him. I told him what my father had told me weeks earlier, that it had never been about distrust of any specific person, only about making sure love was never the only thing standing between me and having somewhere safe to bring my children home to. Dylan had no response to that, which felt, in its own way, like the most honest answer he had given me since Christmas of the previous year, when none of this had yet begun to unravel, and I still believed, the way I imagine most people believe right up until the moment they can't anymore, that our marriage was simply going through something we would eventually move past together. Life slowly reorganized itself over the following months into a new, quieter shape. I returned, part-time at first, to the marketing role I had left during my pregnancy with Eli. Rebuilding a professional identity, I hadn't realized I'd been slowly setting down for years in favor of a version of myself defined almost entirely by being someone's wife. Nora adjusted the way young children often do, with a resilience that both comforted and quietly broke my heart, asking occasional questions about why Daddy lived somewhere else now. Questions I answered honestly, but gently, careful never to let my own grief become the architecture of how she understood her own family. Eli grew the way infants do, entirely unaware of the legal battle that had unfolded around his first months of life, unaware of deeds and depositions, and a corporate email that had, in its own quiet way, determined the shape of his childhood custody arrangement before he was even old enough to smile intentionally. My father remained exactly who he had always been, present every Saturday morning for pancakes, present every Sunday afternoon reading to Nora in the same rocking chair that had once belonged to my mother, present, quietly and without announcement, at every point where his presence actually mattered rather than simply looked good from the outside. One evening nearly a year after that 4 a.m. phone call, sitting on my back porch while Nora chased fireflies across the yard and Eli slept against my chest in a carrier, I asked my father whether he had ever doubted, in the moment he decided to structure that deed 4 years earlier, that he might be overreacting to a marriage that, at the time, showed no visible signs of trouble. He considered the question the way he considered most things, unhurried, unwilling to offer a simpler answer than the honest one. "I never thought I was protecting you from Dylan specifically," he said. "I thought I was protecting you from the version of the world where love is treated as legally sufficient protection, when it never has been and never will be. That's not cynicism, Grace. That's just 32 years of watching what happens to people who assumed otherwise." I thought about Aunt Diane, whose story I had heard in fragments my whole childhood, without ever fully understanding why my father told it so carefully, so specifically, at family gatherings, where the lesson always seemed to land a little differently depending on who was listening. I understood it now in a way I never had before Eli's birth, in a way that required actually living inside the exact scenario my father had spent decades quietly guarding against. People sometimes ask, when I tell this story now, whether I regret marrying Dylan at all, whether 11 years and 2 children were simply the cost of a mistake I should have seen coming. I don't experience it that way, and I don't think honesty requires me to pretend otherwise simply because the ending turned painful. The version of Dylan I married at 26 was, as far as I could ever tell, genuinely present, genuinely kind, genuinely invested in the life we were building. Something shifted in him somewhere along the way, gradually enough that I couldn't locate the exact moment, the way erosion rarely announces itself as a single dramatic event. What I regret, if regret is even the right word, is not the marriage itself, but the years I spent assuming that loving someone fully required setting aside the same careful attention I would have given any other important decision in my life. My father taught me, without ever saying it directly until I finally asked, that protecting yourself and loving someone fully are not opposites. They can, and perhaps should, exist in the same life at the same time, quietly, The way a deed sits filed away in a drawer for 4 years. Never needed, never mentioned, simply present in case the day arrives when it finally matters. So here is the question I still find myself returning to, more than a year later, sitting on a porch that will always, now, legally and otherwise, belong to me and my children alone. If someone who loved you quietly prepared for a possibility you couldn't yet imagine, would you have called it distrust? Or would you have called it exactly what it actually was? Someone making sure you'd always have somewhere safe to come home to, no matter what happened to the people you trusted along the way. I would love to hear what you would have done in my place, whether you would have wanted to know about a precaution like that in advance, or whether you think some protections are kinder left quiet until the day they're finally needed. Share your thoughts in the comments, because someone reading them tonight might need permission to understand that preparing for the worst is not the same as expecting it, and that the people who love us most sometimes show it in ways we don't fully recognize until years later, standing on a porch we never had to lose. This video is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection. All names, characters, and events are fictional. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about resilience, quiet strength, and the kind of justice that protects rather than destroys, subscribe to Sweet Vindication, and we'll see you in the next one.